This is the last Chitauri for Oyisa. A live stream link to this debate is also being sent out in the WhatsApp group. So if anyone new that is not currently at the tournament, once that link is sent, you can send it to them and they will be able to watch the debate. With that being said, I'm just going to introduce the motion for the final Jozi round 2022. This house believes that comedians should have a social responsibility for their choice of material. It will be recommended to have one person within the opposition group, those who have Triton, those who have Chitauri. I will be sharing this debate. On my panel is Bathandwa, Rumbidzai, and Mkhabela. With that being said, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister, and
in most instances and in this very specifically, right? Like many communities have a specific social message, and it's very deliberate, right? So, like, you don't just joke, you feel like an underlying social or political message. And we think that's part of the possible. It's incredibly hard to divorce that most of the time, right? We think about Dave Chappelle and the horrible things he said. We also think about Judge Jeffries when he talks about like his jokes about gun laws and abortion, right? That's part of the possible with like social impact and political impacts, and we think that you can't divorce it at that point. So the first mechanism and the first impact on which we work, right? What is the impact of being socially cognizant and responsible, right? So let's do the comparative. Like, who else would you likely to get social messages from? Politicians or academics? Who's likely to spread feminism besides like Ntshangase and Sarah Silverman and Amy Schumer? It's people like Lwandle, right? But like on a Friday night, when you're super alone in your room, are you more likely to listen to like to watch Sarah Silverman joke, or are you more likely to do like the very base things by Lwandle? So we think, what's the explicit mechanism here? We think we're a lot more accessible. Not only are we more accessible, we give you external motivations for people to approach the economy. So it's very hard, unless you're a rating coach, to convince people to read complex literature about things. However, we think that like people have a structural incentive to listen to these social impacts, to listen to these arguments, because they want to see comedy. People love laughing. Human beings love laughter, right? So we think, secondary analysis, we think that the audience then, who do have incentives to watch comedy, are more receptive to your political messages. When someone's not lecturing you, you're more likely to take in the message and entertain thought. Why? Because it's not adversarial. This is key. Mostly, you read academics who disagree with, or you listen to politicians who disagree with. So you internalize it, you're more receptive to it, and the people grab your attention by the first time. So this is pretty much a trade-off. Or you're more likely to watch a like special by a comedian that you love, or a super boring documentary that's very accurate, right? That's why we all like love watching John Oliver or Seth Meyers or whatever, as opposed to like watching 24-hour news channel like CNN, because it's so much more accessible. So what's important here? We're going to make a conversation that we're not going to make a utopian society, but we do think that so we don't have to go through and solve everything, but we do think that comedians have a unique niche and a unique platform and a unique opportunity, and that's why we're referring to all closing.
Ntshangase is incredibly liberal, and she's known to be liberal. Do you think anyone sufficiently conservative is actually watching her Netflix show?
So, look, we don't need to. So, that's a different thing. So, like, we are making a concession that we want to create a utopian society where we fix everything. We think this is, like, a lot of the mechanisms that are going to come on the margins. We don't persuade the masses of conservative people. But here's the comparatives I was, I hope you respond to it in your extension. Like, a conservative person, or they're more likely to have their mind changed by Bible books, or they're more likely to have their mind changed by Sarah Silverman. Right? Sarah Silverman is so much more accessible, and like, so they're so much more likely to watch any comedian. Just some people here, like, social responsibilities are just more funny. The audience loves like observational comedy. When comedians have an acute understanding of the social dynamics of people love listening to that. So this is, as an actor of a comedian, we actually like very much promote the interest of that actor because people are retaining their jokes are funny. Like, people love observational humor. When people point out truths in society that we've always thought about, but we've never truly articulated, then it's a feeling of catharsis, right? When comedians say truths, like, we think that's incredibly funny, and it's really good for the actor of the audience and the actor of the comedian. Just find out our impacts here. Like, social consciousness, we're making some marginalized groups, we're making material improvement in their conditions, even if it's only on the margins. Please stand aside and quote Max in the last debate, I'm not quite sure where opening government's case goes. Because when we talk about social responsibility, it's not just about whether or not we think that we are being socially nice guys, but it's about how are we taking responsibility mechanistically. The reason that the opening government is going to miss today's debate is because this isn't a debate about whether or not we are genuinely nice, it's about the mechanisms through which we take accountability. What we tell you from opening opposition is fuck social responsibility, take professional responsibility. We're going to tell you two things as our speech. Firstly, their mechanism doesn't necessarily work to deal with the offenses of the worst actor, i.e., we're going to use what Adam attempted to do and show you why Hannah Gadsby is always going to be liberal, but someone like Dave Chappelle is unlikely to respond to social consequences. The second thing I'm going to do to you during my speech is show you why professional responsibility as a mechanism better engages with questions of whether or not people are going to be offensive and the nature of the material that they choose. It is important then to realize that this is a debate about how we make choices about material, not necessarily about what material it is. What that then means is that this debate from both sides then needs to ask the question, how are they currently choosing what material to make, and what sense of responsibility best allows for the best, the least offensive, the most socially progressive material. Cool. Let's get straight into some recontextualization. There's going to be no explicit response, because if you haven't noticed yet, I'm counting from it. Firstly, what do we think social responsibility is? We think Frankie does a good job at making my job easy by saying that it's just about being cognizant. I'm going to be charitable, take it further. We think social responsibility might be acknowledging you're wrong. So Dave Chappelle being like, yo guys, okay, maybe I shouldn't have been transphobic. It could even go so far as things like social reparation, things like donations to transgender charities or formal apologies. Social responsibility, though, as a mechanism, relies on social engagement. It is to say that I have an impact on the social atmosphere of transgender people within the society. I'm going to engage and I'm going to apologize. We say, in comparison, professional responsibility looks like taking account by virtue of the fact that your profession is linked to that offense. What would that mean, sort of clearly, in terms of the difference then? We would say, rather than Dave Chappelle apologizing, Dave Chappelle would have to hire a transgender opening act. Rather than someone simply saying that I'm sorry that I did something offensive, they make specific changes to the professional decisions, the professional setup of both their set, the shows that they're doing, and the material that they're running. We think then that the worst harms mentioned by the government bench are already mitigated. That is to say that even when someone is actively transphobic, at the point at which they take professional responsibility, we are likely to see incremental change in the very least by the composition of sets and who's performing with them. Secondly, we would say that the problem with material in and of itself is not just that it is not conscious, but secondly, that it exists within a largely isolated system. There's a very interesting Twitter account that you can find, which is called That Is a White Panel. And what it does is it shows you every time British comedy shows have exclusively white panels. That means more than 6 people. The reason that is so high is because social responsibility, I mean, saying inoffensive jokes, means very little for the representation of comedians of color. It means very little for the creation of a comedy circuit that is actually positively affecting social change, like Frankie wants to happen. So it's not just Hannah Gadsby not being a sexist, it's having a transgender person running comedy instead. We think that, and the reason that this can win the debate is because the government bench's case so far is predicated on creating a circuit of comedy that is more positive, one that is at the very least less offensive, and at the very best runs material that is better. Simply by looking at the difference in mechanisms, we think it's clear that we prevent the most offensive material, because people probably don't want to be fired, and I'll speak about that more in a second. But secondly, we create systemic change by virtue of the fact that we encourage people to make transformative decisions rather than retroactive apologies. I'll take you shortly. Right? Finally then, what do we think professional responsibility does as a mechanism then? Right? We think it ultimately transforms the way that people engage with their jobs. It says that because, as Frankie himself analyzes, there is a social element to comedy, and because I am profiting off of the social by virtue of being a comedian, that the mechanism through which I cause harm isn't just my exposure, it's the fact that you're paid to see my show. At that point then, we think that the accountability measure can't just be social. It can't just be this question of whether or not I'm doing something responsible. We think it has to be more direct and more transformative. Sure.
Okay, so I think it works better if you are socially responsible so that you don't have to do damage control of having like a shitty joke and then having to do the policy that you want. Isn't it better to just do both?
No, right? So the whole point of my case is to say that the point at which you think you're going to get fired, if you're actively transphobic, you're going to be more conscientious about the jokes that you run. That is not to say that you'll never run jokes about trans people, but rather that the consequences are more likely to be actively discouraging rather than to necessitate fake apologies like we got from Dave Chappelle. Why is that important for the industry? This is my first level of explicit analysis. Because the social is made professional through comedy, it means that comedy is generally ruled by a controversy industrial complex. This is to say that even after Dave Chappelle apologized for being explicitly transphobic, Netflix continued his jokes in his comedy deal. This is to say that ultimately speaking then, controversy, social irresponsibility is actively profitable on both sides, and the act of being socially responsible is one that mechanistically prevents people from doing what the government bench wants them to do. We would say that on the comparative, professional responsibility, the point at which I know that my jokes are at the very least going to take money away from my white opening act that I like, and at the very worst are going to make me no longer sit on this panel show, is more likely to, by a mechanism, create the sort of equitable sphere of comedy that we want. So if the social is made professional by virtue of comedy as a mechanism, we would say then that the best way to engage with this responsibility is professional. Lose your job, hire better people, transform your running orders, rather than saying, I'm sorry, or I'm trying to be conscientious in the first place. We think, to finally engage with that PR, and links more to my analysis, we think that if this analysis that comes from the government bench that says, no, we would rather be preemptively conscientious so no one gets offended and I never have to fire someone, we think that that's probably true on both sides. On either side, we would say that the average comedian is likely to not be offensive. The average comedian is likely to avoid having to face professional repercussions. But what our policy does uniquely, or our approach to this debate, our principle, does uniquely, is engage with those who step over the line. Your Dave Chappelles who are unlikely to ever respond to social controversy meaningfully. Your comedians who are specifically galvanized by the alt-right, who are laughing at the fact that liberals are upset. Professional responsibility links the offense to the mechanisms in which they make money, and we think that creates better change. That's a better way to engage with comedy as a profession. But finally, we would say that social consequences and social conscientiousness is relatively immaterial. Even if I say inoffensive jokes, I can still have a all-white panel. Even if I'm relatively aware of how offensive my jokes are, I can still have a comedy circuit that is entirely male. We say that social consequences are relatively less impactful on the sort of transformative effect that all sides are looking for. 3 reasons. 1, because these comedians still have tours and people are likely to still be paying for them. The controversy industrial complex doesn't just affect Netflix deals, it also affects ticket sales. Secondly, because they are galvanized by conservative forces who find the fact that liberals are offended humorous. And finally, because we think it is still easy to recover from being socially offensive, because at some point something else happens and we bounce back. The thing that my kids always do in the news finals is run a counter panel, show them that you can win with a counter
Before I start, can I just make a very short shout out? I just wanted to say thank you to Rose. I really love you guys a lot. And thank you, Daddy. Is there a moral obligation? And the second is, do comedians a large social impact that you need to come to know? So firstly, in terms of clarification about what this debate is on, and you think it's very great and actually tries to do its answer from, but here's a couple of reasons why it doesn't work. So the first is that obviously it's not mutually exclusive. I think it actually works better if under our context you are socially aware of the impact of comedy you have had, and then you also simultaneously have professional responsibility. That way, you show that you are more invested, you have more of an impact when it comes to issues that direct people come around. So we think the mechanism between the target government and our side. But secondly, let's also clarify what we need today. This is for open opposition and this is for closed opposition. So, comedians should not have a social responsibility. That means that you have to defend being agnostic on the impact your jokes have. Right? And that's the burden of proof for both the opposition benches today. Alright, so we think if there are arguments to not prove that, let's class the debate on what they have to use in this debate. Second, let's clarify this debate, right? What do you actually mean? How is it implemented in reality? So, how would jokes constructed under their context? So, you go to like a bar, you go to a comedy store, you have jokes that are funny. And in our context, you have jokes that are funny, and you also become very material conditions, right? So we think there's a clear impact, for example, after the Dave Chappelle special, when we ended up talking about trans people and girls and things like that, and how we ended up reaffirming transphobic relationships that people have in society, making spaces where trans people interact with cis people even more hostile, making it even more when it came to disclosing their gender identity, because they're seen as a joke, they're caricatured by Dave Chappelle. So we think that in their context, it's likely to happen more. The difference is they were trying to do damage control by hiring a trans comedian. Why is that not good? Firstly, it already happened. There was Daphne Dog, right? She committed suicide because she tried to defend Dave Chappelle. We think the worst case scenario is that you use the fact that you have a trans person as another comedian as leverage to defend the fact that you're not really problematic. We think it would have been better if you didn't need to do that in the first place, because you were retaining the degree of harm that you're having in the society. So that deals with most of the mechanisms of how we can implement this. So now we're going to answer the question about rights and obligation. So, we want to say something slightly philosophical here. So, there's this principle, it's called ought implies can. You have a moral obligation that is proportional to your capacity to enact change. What does that mean? It means if you have the ability to influence people's opinions, if you have the ability to tap into a niche that other people cannot, you have an obligation to do that. So, why do you think you have a unique capacity to shape people's opinions? So, here we say that communities uniquely have preference shaping power. You have the ability to tap into people's interests and desires. You often talk about things that are like very taboo, things that are private, you typically talk about in a more formal setting, right? This ends up creating a parasocial trust that the audience has with the community. So you have a unique relationship that is different from any kind of relationship that people often have with the audience. That means you're uniquely effective. If you're uniquely effective, you should be conscious of that and you've got social responsibility. So under our context, why do you think this is not for us to win today? If there's a moral obligation, then by necessity, you have to adopt social responsibility, right? And that was our first point of this. That was our first argument, right? So, giving that overview, and I think we've proven arguably, but I want to engage now with here. Okay, now, second question, we're talking about the impact that humans have globally. So, the point of this talk is that something like on the other side, there are massive problems when it comes to the behavior of humans. So, the first mechanism of why there are problems on the other side is this concept of motivating. What's motivating? It's when, for example, you're making a point that's ambiguous, right? Where people challenge you, you appeal to something very sort of reasonable and understandable. It's I'm just making jokes, right? But when people like it, it's not going to actually be social commentary, right? And that's what the Chachalia does, right? So when he said, for example, that he's team term, he's able to get away with that by saying, I'm just making jokes, not making social commentary. But when we make social commentary about Black Lives Matter and Black people, he's able to say, these are just jokes. This is social commentary. So there's this unique ability to comedians to be able to dance around being accountable and in their content. Whereas under our context, when you're not social responsibility, it is more likely that you're be held accountable and you will be cognizant of the fact that you actually be funny and also you will have an immediate impact on people. And then the second one is about capturing attention. Yes.
Comedy specifically profits off of controversy. The only way that you can prevent the sort of offense that you're speaking about is if you interrupt that professional mechanism. Our side is the only one that does that.
No, so I do think, okay, well, let me explain why you mentioned consciousness. But secondly, it is possible to be controversial and not be transphobic or racist, right? You can talk about issues that people typically don't talk about because they're aroused in this country, right? You do it in like a comedic way. That's comedic relief, right? So we think under our context, you manage to get all the with evidence, either way. So what I'm going to do now is explain the way of this material. So we're aiming to also like a lot of parenting materials not responding to, like how Frank was able to explain to you why YouTube videos like to be effective in terms of changing the purposes of people and actually changing people's minds. So I think that's important. Please consider that when you're listening to the closing discussion. And another thing that I want to say is that comedians have such a unique ability to influence how people think, right? And we think that's very important that you acknowledge that in constructing your jokes. We think, and our outcomes very likely, is that you're probably still trying to do controversial jokes, but only this time you're conscious of the fact that there are certain ways in which your jokes can be misinterpreted, or certain ways in which your jokes can actually happen, and it did just impact on people. It's not that it's better for you to just have a more modern version of the joke. It is going to be wrong, but it will still gauge the similar amounts of amusement and critique. Amusement and right? So, okay, two things. We have a moral obligation, right? We explain what a moral obligation is. That's what we needed to do in order to come today. But it's not even that you explain what was really happening to you, and I think that's what it was fun.
People who are trans, like they use the example of Davies, right? This is a slippery slope, as I said, because likely what we say is, they say, so this is that entire point is based on comedians have this ability to influence people. They have this ability that lots of people listen to them, and therefore they can initiate social change and all of that. And as a response, we're going to say obviously, comedians, right? People who listen to comedians, right? They likely agree with their ideas, or so they like the idea. They likely agree with their ideas. So this influence that they apparently have in going to do right. And if they don't listen to them, they agree with their ideas, right? I'm not going to change their ideas anyway because they have this, this staunch, disagreement. Right, so that's the first thing, right? And then, they say, comedians are going to be held more accountable. They make a weird point, and it's like they say they're going to be held more accountable because something, right? And what we say is actually, on our side, they're going to be held accountable, which isn't actually, from the case that they present, isn't an accountable side. But in fact, we're going to have more accountability on our side, and even if we don't have accountability, and in the case we don't have accountability, they aren't going to be making these judges to be held accountable for, because, as we said, right? So what was our case, just so we can reaffirm, we said, we don't think that being cancelled is enough of a deterrent for people to not make these risky jokes, to not beat down these groups that have been repressed for centuries, right? And so just like that was our case as a counterpart, and yeah, right. So that's why there can be more on the outside, and it's also just basically a summation of Dan's speech. So what am I going to do in I'm going to be giving how comedians choose, what they're going to say, what their material is, and then how it's going to affect their material, the material that they choose, if they are held more accountable through, through their jokes affecting their job. Right, so firstly we need to talk about how comedians actually choose their material. And in the modern world, comedians choose their material based on what is going to get likes, what is going to, get a reaction out of people, get a rise out of people, and what this is going to cause is if people, click on their videos, watch their videos, and this is going to signal to, the producers of the show or whatever, to, say that, oh, people like it, and therefore we should promote it, we should pay these people more, we should give them more, more comedy deals, like what happened with Dave Chappelle. Right, we couldn't still have a comedy show on Netflix even after we got cancelled. That is why, cancelism and social responsibility isn't enough. And that's why we said job accountability is more, right? So then how does this affect how comedians choose it? Because based on how material is chosen, when the rise that people get is going to harm their job, they are not going to choose this, these jokes that get a rise out of people as often. We are not saying that they are never going to make these jokes, right? We are saying that when these people base their entire identity around a single idea, a singular idea that, oh, I'm this person, therefore I hate foreign people, etc. Right? That is where the harm comes in, because when people follow that person, they will, say, oh, darn, because these people that the group hates is, or that the person hates them, aliens, right? So because these people choose jokes that are right on people, but then this rise is going to affect them negatively. They aren't going to choose these jokes often. They're going to have a more conscious choice about what they choose as a joke, which is therefore going to make them say these jokes less often, right? And in the case that they do say these jokes, they're going to be held accountable. They're going to lose their job. They're going to have to force systematic change. Otherwise, their entire livelihood is going to be negatively affected. Right. So then so like we said, we're not saying these jokes can't be made there. It is important. Some kind of agree with saying that they should be able to, with slight government, then they sometimes make these jokes, but to understand people, right? But what they're saying, they can't make these jokes constantly, as I said. Right. Yeah. So what have I done in my speech, right? Firstly, I said this is a strange case. Firstly, it's a strange case based on counterpart anyways. Then I said, rebutted what they point about the harm that they do, right? And then I said, how it's going to change how comedians make their jokes, and it's therefore going to make their jokes less risky or less risky more often. And yeah, thank you.
Then I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I am so for counterparts, but there have to be a couple of things. They have to be actually proven in terms of the burden. They have to be genuine to the motion, and they have to be different from the benefits that we actually get on the government side in some kind of way. So I'm so sorry, I'm not trying to be mean, but it didn't work. So let's just quickly do this. Dan's counterprop is disingenuous because it doesn't discuss the choices matter in terms of like what the motion actually states, being that we need to have social consideration in the choices matter that these comedians are making. Your choices matter doesn't come in terms of consideration at a point in which you've already made the speech, you've already given, like you've already made the offensive joke, so it's not genuine to the idea of choosing your matter based on responsibility. Secondly, it doesn't show any kind of burden on comedians to actually like be the ones who produce this kind of diversity in the entertainment industry. Thirdly, it weaponizes the shit out of marginalized groups, right? Marginalized people become consequences to the actions of Dave Chappelle. The trans person who comes and is hired becomes literally the punishment Dave Chappelle receives for his transphobic comments, right? This is not something we can support on our side, and we don't understand why it's something that has existed until the closing half. We think that it uses people as a means to an end. Trans individuals deserve their own space within the entertainment industry that's not dependent on being a punishment for a white man who makes an offensive joke. So what this means is that we need to actually reframe this debate, leaving out the entire counterprop, and talk about what this motion wants us to talk about. And here's where we respond to Adam's POI, where we need to show you that we're not burdened to show that every single horrible comedian is going to become nice under this motion, right? Which is something that they try to burden us to do when you say liberal, people who are like usually conservative are not going to be listening to the social responsibility that our opening gov brings in. What we need to say to this is two things. Firstly, our speech and our extension as closing is going to not only cater for what the opening government does very nicely, but then secondly, it's going to say why this is not actually a debate about what you should include in your speech, but rather what you should leave out. We think this is most genuine to the motion. But then, secondly, we want to tell you that we're not burdened to show you why comedians are likely to be, why comedians are likely to all become transformed in this kind of situation. All this motion burdens us to do really is to say why they should, ideally, be having consideration for social responsibilities, as opposed to their only consideration being for things like humor. This is where this debate should have taken place, and it's disappointing that it hasn't. I'm going to be bringing 2 points in today's debate. The first one is the idea of validation of concepts like it's just a joke, and then the second one is the idea of appropriation of people's lived experiences. What these points are basically going to aim to do is show you why consideration of your matter as a comedian before you say that matter is far more important than what Dan's team brings to us, which is the idea of consequence. We always prioritize the joke not coming out over it coming out and being bandaged up. We always prioritize people not being cut over them being cut and having a nice bandage placed on them. Why is this? Point number 1. The idea of it's just a joke. It's just a joke, something that we have all heard coming out of the mouths of racists, coming out of the mouths of transphobes. Comedy is something that we can all cater to. Comedy is something that's highly relatable to all of us. It's just a joke. It's not something you should be offended by, right? This is something that's perpetuated when you hear comedians not considering their matter before they make that matter. Because yes, there might be consequences, and yes, there might be inclusion of socially responsible messages, but at the point at which anybody can now, at the point at which any comedian is getting up there without social consideration and in their matter, and including any kind of matter that is not socially considerate, is the point at which that is a joke being made. What happens when we see skilled individuals, people whose livelihoods rely on them making jokes about marginalized groups, is it's just a joke. Now, when my friend does it to a larger extent, because a comedian on stage made a joke about racism, because a comedian on stage made a joke that is mildly transphobic, right? Even in this slight lack of consideration, it's exacerbated. People take it away and they don't see the consequences. What they see is that this is matter that can be joked about, and we don't think it is. I'll tell can be joked about on our side of the show.
I mean, I think you're a little disingenuous to the case, right? Like, do you think Dave Chappelle should still have a job?
Right, we don't think that Dave Chappelle should still have a job, but we also don't think that's exclusive to your side. Dave Chappelle not having a job is still a consideration for social responsibility, but moreover, it's something that caters for consequences over consideration. This debate is supposed to take place at the point in which we're looking at consideration, i.e. considering social responsibility in the matter that you choose. What that places the burden on us to do is to talk about consequences. This has nothing to do with consideration of matter. This is a distinction that's important, right? And this is something that I've already said. Kindly listen. So the idea of, the point that I proved with my idea of it's just a joke is that at any point in which we're having comedians coming on stage and making jokes about material that is about marginalized groups, making jokes such as characterized by our opening half, it's something that shows individuals that these are jokes that are okay to make, and this is exacerbated and is used to gaslight these marginalized communities in the form of it's just a joke. Secondly, why is it not okay for this matter to be thought of as something that can even be joked about? And this is the idea of appropriation of people's lived experiences. When we see that this matter is something that can be joked about, even if your joke is not explicitly harmful, is not explicitly offensive, if you are somebody who is not a part of a marginalized group and you are making a joke that involves that marginalized group, you are getting people's laughs, and if you are a comedian, you are getting people's money off of the existence of individuals who have an incredibly tough time as it is. It's not something that's your property, and it's not something that you should be able to use when and if you like to gain laughs, or even worse, to gain money. So when you give us the idea that we gave you on closing side, that this is not just about what they should include in their speech, although we do think that's a part that as our opening gives us, this is more so what they should exclude from their speech in the first place. We're most genuine to the motion. We tell you how this realistically materializes outside of just comedy, and then tell you that Dan's countertop just doesn't stand. I'm proud of
I just want to remind the House that during speeches, if you look for loudly, you'll actually be distracted across the panel. So please, either don't whisper or make sure we don't hear you. That being said, I'd like to call upon the member for the opposition. Here.
Can everyone hear me? Alright, perfect. So, closing opposition, Adam here, he, him. Happy to take POS. As I should be. Let me just have a quick moment. Alright. I will begin in 3, 2, 1. One of the biggest and most unprecedented changes in style of comedy the entire comedic audience has ever viewed has been that of Trevor Noah. Because before he got that job on the Davies show, he was both incredibly funny and incredibly good at describing our South African post-apartheid political moment. Because, and we think that the true case is that he didn't care, right? He was living anecdotal experiences that were relevant to all of our lives, and that was incredibly insightful. He then moved to the Davies show with lots of analytical writers, lots of people thinking about issues, particularly with the level of the liberal social justice swing, and the comedy died. We felt like we were being lectured to. He was less funny, and he actually had less insights in the first place. So what is the closing opposition line? We do think the opening opposition was incredibly, at least somewhat interesting with, professional versus societal, but we think it's very small in comparison. What we are going to do, we're going to see that if you really want social responsibility, if you really want to see some kind of change, you don't actually try to be socially responsible, it just happens naturally. So 2 main responses to opening. Firstly, let's get a proper idea of what social responsibility is, because opening got it wrong, the rest of the team did get it right. But social responsibility is not the backlash you get for doing something wrong. That is a part of it, but it's a mindset, right? It's making sure that when you write jokes, and when you deliver them, you're trying to achieve a social justice goal, some social goal, right? This idea that you're just getting backlash and thinking properly is a part of it, very minute part of it. Secondly, what I did in opening is that it makes it easy to listen. 4 responses. Firstly, trivializing this idea, because we commonly work out to make ideas shorter. Secondly, we're going to bring it into the political binary. No one writing is resisting to Lwandle, and no one left wing is resisting to right? And at least not in any serious way that might be the case. Thirdly, we finally have to be sufficiently serious, right? If you look at Ntshangase, she isn't funny because she's trying to make social progression. She's being serious. No one's off for watching Ntshangase special, let's be honest. And all the others are not funny. I think I should that sufficiently. We get 2 other ideas in the room. Then firstly, the automatized canon, but it's not actually hearing about social change. The entire discussion is important, and then it's thinking on that, we're going to get that things down. But secondly, then also that there's always an underlying message, an underlying motive, behind comedy. We just don't think this is true. Some kind of usually telling stories about our lives. Then we get this idea low from opposing government, where we have this idea that people aren't taking accountability for their actions. And we get it for a few things here. Firstly, if David actually went to say sorry and firstly did sorry, no one will actually believe him. Let's be honest, right? We get even bigger than that. We trust that at this moment, that even if David doesn't think that's a responsibility, we'll have enough people engaging with what he said that the harm of what he does is sufficiently done. We don't need to argue with David Trouble, but we do need the community to maybe have a cross-disciplinary about him, and we trust that that'll be sufficiently restorative. Now I'm going to get on to make sure that if you want social change, you don't actually analytically try to think about it happening before I can develop this skill.
Okay, firstly, explain why that natural change is likely to happen, and secondly, while it's happening, there are still people being harmed by these jokes. Why not just be preemptive? Why wait for the natural progression instead of actively intervening now?
No. Okay, so we're not saying there's a natural progression that needs to happen. We're saying we're actually dealing with the current way that comedy is working. When we're talking about a natural change, we're saying yes, sometimes the response is good and we think it's sufficient to be encouraging to these people that the society has enough. We're not saying there are these conclusions some long-term change. I don't understand where we get that idea. Okay, major code opposition extension. If you want more social responsibility, more social change, you don't think about it. And that's the core idea is that if you're thinking consciously, you're not actually doing that as well as you could. Let's have this discussion. Let's look on the government bed. If you're thinking consciously about being socially responsible, that can end up in 2 ways. Firstly, you're too scared to actually tell those about the social justice issues that you're talking about, and so you don't get this implicit change idea. John Oliver is a perfectly good idea of this. He talks about incredibly important issues, but all the jokes are about pink snakes flying out of Mars, right? It's not actually relevant to the issues, and so we're not having change in mindset. But if we talk about Catshaza, who makes the jokes about political issues, we tell her that she's not funny because she can't have individual anecdotes. She's so worried about being generalized about the entire community, including people, that we can't actually have that humor because it is too generalized, and part of what's funny is that it has to be specific. What we do say, though, is you get a much better discussion if David tells us something awful, and then we need to have a proper discussion about what's happening. If you're being so conscious about being politically correct and being conscious, you're not going to have to teach tasks that need to happen. David is going to do that when he's not worried about social responsibility. When you are worried about social responsibility, you keep it on the surface and then end up being wishy-washy. But now let's also talk about when we're unconsciously just doing jokes because what we can feel is that the majority of comedians aren't really worried about political issues. We're doing jokes just for just. Most comedy is incredibly backward with no major goal. We tell you that this is when we have those real discussions, even more than when it's political. Why is this the case? Because oftentimes humans are most creative and they think about stuff and they're not actually being analytical. If we're overthinking what issues currently exist, we're going to come across the same social justice issues that we've been seeing. When we're backward, that changes. Look at the Office, for example. Michael Scott was never supposed to be a character that was about major political change. But what did the Office do? We had a major, very important discussion that isn't happening enough about how soul-crushing the Catholic American 1950s that absolutely changed what the social world looks like, and the Office was important. They weren't trying. Simultaneously, we think that they were doing this in the way that it analyzes misogyny, but just by trying to go to no major aim. You get new ideas here. But furthermore, let's also have a discussion about how it ends up being an episode. Because their main idea here, right, was that they were worried about an election that isn't funny. If you're being analytical and you're being socially responsible, that means that you need to think about things hard. These ideas are difficult. And that means that your talks end up looking like lectures. It's why it's not interesting to listen to debaters because we think we're trying to think very difficult. We think Mkhabela is the quintessential example of this, right? He had to stop thinking about what social implications what he said in American politics were, and he stopped getting money. He stopped joining the student industry because they felt like they were getting elections to do, and those who didn't agree with him didn't feel like they were getting an answer because they weren't sort of charismatic gestures. So what do? If you want social change, you don't have to think about it. Those are opportunities for new ideas, more difficult discussions, and more just getting all around these kind of paths.
Responsibility is something that is fulfilled by Canadians acting to shape things so they're conscious of what their master is going to be. And here we think this Canadians ought to be socially responsible, but will be best forms of social responsibility by thinking about what they're saying. We don't think this is something that is fulfilled on the side of opposition from the counter, or from the idea of just not doing things, or just not thinking. We think this is only done at the point in which Canadians are socially responsible. Social responsibility is not about escaping communities because teachers or educators, but it is about them being conscious of not saying certain things because of the impact that they have, because of the audience that they are to be able to do. The second question is that I was asked about is something that people that organically is asking for.
And so as a society speaks about the idea that we don't need to think about anything and this is likely to be something that happens organically. Give examples about people who just only analyze or only think about their social impact and just analyze. We're sorry that I'm not just in shape me and don't know how this is. Because thinking about what you're going to say, anything is likely to make somebody who is both funny as well as quote unquote woke. Why?
going to have the desired outcome. Perfect example, this debate. We've had shifting from the audience, we think we're able to do both, right? Secondly then, we think that this needs to be done with an intentional amount of because as people are not thinking about this, you're far more likely to slip up, you're far more likely to offend everyone else. And the point in which we have communities not thinking about what they're saying or not being able to be conscious, we think that we run the risk of saying that people need to be heard in order for us to have a conversation. We think at this point we're far too tired of having doing things in the name of discourse. We think that that's like a very late argument at this point. We don't think that things need to be done in the name of discourse for us to like that. The other thing, actually, before I carry on,
So you can laugh at our case all you want, but what you haven't done is engage with the fact that we are the only side that deals with the indignant, bigoted comedian who doesn't respond to social incentives and instead will only stop being offensive at the point at which they might be fired.
Yeah, actually, this will be my third point. Let's deal with this idea of this counterpart that we get from open opposition. Essentially, open opposition entire case is dependent on the fact that we also target the mechanism that makes people money. So, when you're somebody who is harmful, which is harmful comment to a specific minority, we ought to force you to create systematic change within your industry as a form of responsibility. A few reasons why we think this is good. First of all, I already shows you how we weaponize minority groups by the leaders. Secondly, then, we think it is far more likely to put them more like put minority groups in a space that is excessively harmful. That characterization of these comedians being like white and bigoted and harmful means that we're going to be placing these people into these spaces. This is something that's weird, and we don't care about that individual, like fighting that individual exists if the comparative is placing a minority group in their presence, a minority group in their world. Because all likely to be somebody who's oppressed in that sphere. On the comparative side, we think that not placing that person in that sphere is significantly better. And so I don't leave the bigots alone if it means that we're protecting minority groups and not using them as a token and not using them as a weapon. And third, my third response idea is that forcing systematic change has never been something that has happened well, or that has happened in a manner that has been effective. And the solution to force a system to change as a form of punishment or in a mechanism that is punitive, it's never going to happen and in which people are happy with it. People are also never going to opt into it. Why we think it's important for us to have opt-in specifically in the entertainment industry is because people in the entertainment industry generally tend to meet people who enjoy what they're doing for the pleasure of others. And so here I think you're going to be forcing people to work in these spaces to be a form of punishment for others. We think that you're largely just going to have an unhappy entertainment industry and acting which people are sad. I think that's quite contrary to the idea of comedy itself, so that would be is strange. Lastly, then, at the end of my speech, while I think that we're explicitly winning as a citizen government, is because firstly, we're able to show you that social responsibility doesn't mean that you need to be like a teacher or a history lecturer in order to fulfill your responsibility, rather just to be intentional about what you're saying, and so that you don't harm people. Secondly, then, we prove that intention is important. Lastly, again, we do where things come from, we stand because we go.
Social responsibility is an active mentality. It is actively saying that at every step of the way of creating that material, you are holding what you should be towards whatever social, popular liberal norms exist, and that affects the way in which that material is crafted. We think that often tries in this debate to actually ignore the fact that there's an actual incentive to look and cater your material towards socially responsible or towards seeing the most woke line at the time, and how that affects the way in which that comedy manifests. Because we think that they focus largely on just the people being problematic, but don't look at the actual effects and incentives that how those comedians exist. So then let's understand what we brought to you as closing off and why it's most important and impactful things today. Firstly, let's understand that we actually spoke about at the point in which you don't feel like there's an actual social responsibility in the material you have to give. One, due to the anecdotal nature of most comedians telling your life stories, means that you have resist the temptation for censorship. This means that at the point at which you think that something doesn't agree with the popular liberal line at the time, you are less likely to take it out and actually inform society about what that looks like. This means that the actual benefit of understanding increased degree of demographics of people and individual experiences is removed in the side that's only been addressed by us as CO. Furthermore, let's also then understand in terms of what this looks like in terms of a modern society when comedians tell problematic jokes. Because we think that we're going to be fairly correct in simply assuming that most people are not going to just let problematic jokes stand, but at the point of which engagement can still be beneficial outside of any interference from those comedians after the joke is told, we don't think that there's a necessity for them to adopt some form of social responsibility for us to recognize certain minority communities. They don't do that. No. So then let's understand how we're going to evaluate this debate. Two ways. One, when in itself, what is it a legitimate obligation to place on these comedians? Two, in itself, how does this affect the way in which we engage with minority groups as a result? We think we're simply just going to be more relevant than opening side in this debate because one, they only actually look at the outcomes afterwards and evaluate what we do afterwards, but the mentality itself has the propensity to affect a larger amount of people. No. So then let's also then look at the first point. What do we then get? So let's bring OG back in this debate because right now they're just spectating. So what they said is the fact that because these people have influence, this influence then makes an obligation for them to be conscious of their jokes. Note that in and of itself, that influence doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot tell what you're experiencing your own perspective on a specific issue is. They needed to actually justify limiting the freedoms of those individuals simply because they have the capacity to do something. We think that many people also will agree with the beliefs that these people have, but simply stating that letting influence people doesn't mean that you suddenly need to self-censor. That was flimsy at best, that's why they were forgotten. Secondly, let's also then talk about validation. So this is what we get from closing. Let's have to respond to Abigail so that she doesn't make an accusation of straw manning with representing a bad case. Firstly, let's actually look at validation and what they tell us here. They tell us that these individuals need validation because after something has happened, this happens, they need to experience and apologize in order to feel recognized, the harm themselves has been recognized. Why is that not true? Why does that not matter? One, most of the time, most of those individuals aren't consuming this media, which means that they're not going to experience that harm firsthand, and at the point at which it's not firsthand, it feeds into a broader societal narrative, which they're already suffering already, meaning that your ability to feel a harm from a Davies special is somewhat limited. But let's extend this point to the speech and tell you actually, backlash is the most effective form of validation. Society as it's progressive now doesn't simply let problematic views stand. So now instead of hearing about a Dave Chappelle apologizing for a special you watch, you actively see people reinforcing your existence in society and actively fighting for you. We think that that's a better form of recognizing your existence in society and a better form of validation that doesn't need those comedians to take responsibility in and of themselves. Thirdly, in terms of what they then further tell us as closing, is that they then tell us that, okay, we need now appropriating the experiences of these individuals. As we said specifically, they don't actually engage with how these jokes occur. These jokes occur on an individual basis and individual perceptions of how certain individuals exist and how certain groups and interactions exist in society. Meaning that conveying your perspective on a specific issue is just as much of an extension of your autonomy, even if it means you talk about specific groups. You know, we don't think that just because you aren't a part of a group, how you interact with it suddenly becomes void and something that shouldn't exist at all in society. That's just assertive. Don't think that just because you want to be liberal and woke and throw rhetoric doesn't mean you can't do analysis. We think that at the point at which they don't actually do any concrete work to show you why this influence necessitates that this obligation exists. Oh, I don't know what government's done in this debate. So then before we move on into pragmatic, I'll take over.
Your extension makes no sense. It is still possible to be progressive and be funny. I'm going to give you a list of comedians who are actually funny. Seth Meyers, John Stewart, Sarah.
Okay, I don't need to listen to this.
let's chat about why that actually is disingenuous and straw man the extension. That extension is about censoring yourself because of ways that you may perceive to be problematic that don't align with the current status quo and social liberal art. They don't engage with that. This means that many of you are black, talking about specifically how that black engagement occurs with trans people, facilitating more rich broader discourse about that specific intersectional point in society. Don't just list comedians and act like you've dealt with the extension. Secondly, let's then chat about how we actually pragmatically affect these groups. One, another thing opening gives us that's stupid is that they tell us that things are easier to listen to. As Adam already told you, that in and of itself, this mode of listening to people is in itself not beneficial because it trivializes a lot of these things. A lot of times, many people who are in little spaces already believe it. If anything, you see it now as something which is worth laughing at and worth not engaging with. But then let's extend that idea and say that the most discourse happens in backlash. The one good thing Dan does is he tells you that the thing that creates most controversy is when these comedians say something that's somewhat problematic. Why that specifically matters is because that itself facilitates more engagement around those points than that would have existed anyway. At that point, we think that it's not important that you're easier to listen to and a comedian making jokes about a lighthearted situation, but spurring increased development by removing some form of filter is more beneficial. Thirdly, let's also say that they run away by saying that we're not trying to be perfect by not engaging with the specific audiences of these viewers. Because we don't think that as a trans person you're going to see a lot of the digital special other than the things that make headlines because you know that he's transphobic. If you actually want the discourse and want the delta, we look at the things that make it to the news and look for the best way to engage with it. They don't do that. All they say is that, oh no, you're really absolutist, you don't have to make everyone's life better. Actually deal with the change. We think that we are the ones who actually analyze who's best in this debate, who actually invented us the way we can engage comedy. We're better for representation. We think